I'll start this video out with a question. How many of you remember or happen to be fans of the early Commodore home computers, where the computer was built in to the keyboard and everything was in one self-contained unit? Now this video is not about those early Commodore computers, and lots of companies and brands sold computers such as that, all the way from things like the BBC Micro, all the way down to things like the Tandy Radio Shack family of color computers. Would you believe that there's a modern descendant? Well, here it is. This is the Cybernet Manufacturing Elite 2 Zero Footprint PC, which brings back the whole PC combined with a keyboard all in one compact case idea. I remember seeing these things back in computer magazines in the mid-90s when Cybernet Manufacturing ran advertisements in the back of these magazines for a 486-based version of this. Now this one is not 486 based. This is a Pentium 3 IBM personal computer compatible system, and it has an SIS 630 chipset at its heart. It has integrated video, a built-in keyboard, stereo speakers, connector for a mouse, a floppy drive here at the side, and your choice of a CD or optical drive, a set of audio inputs and outputs, headphones, microphone, line in, I wouldn't say necessarily in that order, 2 USB ports, and this optical drive can optionally be exchanged for a single PCI expansion slot. There are also some other avenues of expansion here, but let's go ahead and power this thing on and see what it does. The power button's up here in the upper right hand corner. All you have to do is press it once and the machine comes to life. Try to ignore the mess that is my computer room. I don't often film down here because this room is an absolute disaster. But there's the startup logo, and then it segues right into booting with Windows. This machine was licensed for use with Windows XP Professional, so that's what it's got on it because I haven't been feeling too adventurous. Now as it is booting up here, we'll go over some of these top lights, these lights that are on the top of the keyboard assembly. There's a 10 megabit Ethernet activity indicator light, 100 megabit Ethernet activity indicator. This light up here is an ACPI light that illuminates only when you're running an ACPI aware operating system. There's the hard drive light, and then there's a light for the floppy drive. Now these stereo speakers definitely won't win any awards for fidelity, but they are better than nothing, and they do get surprisingly loud. And there's the Windows login screen, so let's just go ahead and continue here. There's the example of the built-in sound system. I'll talk a little more about that later. But this thing's performance is actually pretty good. A lot of people out there don't seem to like the SIS chipsets, but this implementation in particular seems to be pretty stable. I really have no complaints. I have a white one of these as well. They came in colors. And I have booted a couple of different operating systems on the white one. The nice thing about the SIS chipset is that it was offering something that Intel simply didn't offer at the time, and that's the ability to use pretty vast amounts of PC-100 or PC-133 SD-RAM. This machine has at least a memory capacity of 1 gigabyte of installed RAM, because my white one has that much memory in it. This one only has 512 megabytes, and could probably benefit from an upgrade, because sometimes when I have a bunch of programs running on here at once, the system does start to hit the paging file a little bit and get a little sluggish as a result. But this thing is capable of doing everything that a regular desktop computer can do. It's just got a different form factor, and you can see about how thick it is there. So it's definitely a chunky PC, but really when you consider how big most computers are, it's not all that bad. And then here's the optical drive, whose eject button is sometimes a little fidgety, but at least it seems to be working right now. This is a CD writer and a DVD reader, what Apple Computer would call a combo drive. And of course this thing has no problem running almost any program you would care to name. You know, we can fire up the web browser here, and please, no derogatory comments on my choice of browser. You use what works for you, I'll use what works for me, and I'm pretty sure we'll both end up going away happy. Now the hard drive that's in this thing is an older IBM DeskStar that's Probably not in the best of shape anymore, and certainly not as fast as it could be. Looks like I got some software updates there. But it's quite happy to take you almost anywhere you'd want to go on the web. There's Yahoo's homepage right now. Why the 2011 Oscars are worth watching. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm not going to be watching them. Probably be listening to a radio program about that time. This thing's processor is a little bit interesting. I suspect that it was replaced at some point in this machine's life, because what we have here is a processor that came along pretty late in the Pentium 3 product life cycle. This is an Intel Pentium 3S Tualatin core. It's a socket 370 flip chip PGA2, and it's clocked at 1.2 gigahertz or thereabouts. For those wondering, that's actually a kind of server-grade Pentium 3 processor, but this thing seems to be perfectly okay with running it and does not complain in the slightest. Ooh, warning! Which brings me to, although this thing is very definitely intended to be a business-grade computer, it does have fairly reasonable graphics horsepower. It wouldn't be happy running some high-end 3D game, but it'll happily do lightweight 3D graphics, and it will also happily play DVD video, of which this is a short example. Oh, drive spun down. Not too bad from the speakers. Better turn that off before the movie companies get as impressed with me as the record companies must be. There is one other thing to talk about software-wise. This thing does have working, functional hardware monitors. You can see a temperature being reported there on 2 zones. You can see, well, there's 3 temperatures there actually, although 2 of them are tracking right in perfect lockstep with one another. And then there's a hard drive temperature as well. Now this thing uses a WinBond low pin count I/O controller, and this particular WinBond chip is capable of doing fan control. And the one fan that this system has, I'll turn the light back on here just so you can kind of see things better than normal, even though I am pleased to say that I did fix the light here in the computer room today, so it works again. I even hung the diffuser back up. But anyway, to get back to the point at hand, this thing does support fan speed control. Although it's not terribly fine-grained, you have to get down to under 30% before it really starts to make much of a difference. And of course the RPMs are not always real accurately reported. When you get down to some of the lower speeds, the RPM indication gets a little bit crazy at times, and sometimes reports the fan doing some 50 or 60,000 RPMs, although now that I've got the camera turned on it, of course, it won't actually do that. And of course you can bring the fan, speed it back up here, you can bring the fan all the way down to a dead stop. Although obviously you wouldn't want to leave it that way because you'll overheat the system, so I better turn that back on. The fan is kind of noisy, so it's nice to be able to slow it down a little bit. Now for the question that I'm sure some of you are eagerly asking, what's inside this crazy thing? Well, it just so happens I have my golden screwdriver, and it really is golden. So we'll pop this thing open and have a look. First, a look at the ports. Here's the power input, which is a single 12-volt DC input, which means at least in theory this thing could probably be operated off of some kind of 12-volt battery if you had to, although you would probably want to make sure that things were a little better regulated than that. There's the Ethernet port, as well as the USB ports, the first set of them. There's a mouse port, and rather surprisingly, there's a keyboard port. Now, I could see a lot of these things being used for point-of-sale applications or something along those lines, but interestingly enough, this keyboard port on the back is completely inactive unless you go into System Setup and actually disable the built-in keyboard. Right next to that is a Kensington hardware lock receptacle, as well as a television video out. A parallel port that, interestingly enough, does not have the, what do they call those, the PC99 color coding. All the other ports on this thing are color-coded. There's an optional modem slot. There's the place for the PCI expansion. There's a single VGA output, an optional second VGA output that if you don't have a second serial port would presumably be replaced by another monitor connector, which this one hasn't got. And then there's the first serial port, and interestingly, those are black in color too. This thing comes apart pretty easily. There's just a row of screws up here that need to be undone, and then the two sandwiches come apart. You can see there's a Windows XP Professional Certificate of Authenticity that somebody's taped over, probably to try and preserve it. There's two air intakes, some rubber feet, of which most of them are missing. But let's go inside. Now with the screws out, the keyboard clamshell cover part simply lifts up. Now there are some cables that you have to be careful of, and one of them is an easily torn ribbon film style cable, and the other one is simply this ribbon cable over here that actually provides the signal to and from the keyboard, and I believe the speakers as well. Now these are still made today. These things are still available. You can still buy one brand new. Cybernet Manufacturing is still in business. And if you get one of the modern ones, they actually do have a touchpad built in, so you don't need an external mouse like I need to use with this one. But I'll go ahead and unplug the rest of these cables and give you a look through, a walk around or something of the inside. There's the keyboard controller, there's the power switch board, one of the two stereo speakers, the status LED indicator board, the other speaker, and the optical drive. You can set the top part aside, and that reveals the motherboard in here. And the motherboard is basically what you'd expect, just a PC board with a slightly different form factor. There's the WinBond low pin count I/O controller, the system ROM. This thing right here is the PCI slot, and the way this is used, there's a U-shaped, my white one has this in it because it doesn't have an optical drive, but there's a U-shaped board that lets you insert a PCI slot in one receptacle, and then the other receptacle plugs into this tab on the edge of the board. There's a CR2032 battery, the second IDE channel for the optical drive, the first IDE channel for the hard drive, which you can see is that aforementioned IBM DeskStar. There's a DC to DC converter in here to provide all the needed operating voltages for the system. There's the floppy drive right here. This is the processor right behind the fan. Got a bunch of capacitors around it, the SIS 630 North bridge, the two memory slots, and that's pretty much all there is to the inside of this thing. Here's the power connector for the fan, some of the ports, the power connector for the motherboard, power connector for the hard drive. This thing's pretty easy to work on too. It's not terribly difficult to take it apart. Now some of you will probably be asking, where can I get one of these? Fortunately, that question has an easy answer. Cybernet Manufacturing, as I said before, is still in business and still manufactures these things. You can buy one brand new for right around the $700, $800 mark, depending on how you equip it, which really isn't bad for an upper mid-range desktop computer. And they have models with at least Core 2 Duo processors, and I think they've got the i5 and i7 now. But if you're willing to avoid taking a hit on depreciation and buy something secondhand, these things do show up on eBay, and they can be had for pretty reasonable money, usually somewhere between $30 and $100, depending on how well equipped they are and what condition they're in. You should definitely do your homework before buying. Now, I have never seen one of these things in the wild, and I have been doing freelance computer consulting since approximately 1995. So it has come as quite a surprise to me that I've never seen one of these things in the wild anywhere, but someone must buy them because they are out there on the market, and the company has managed to stay in business for quite some time. I don't have any affiliation with them or anything like that. It's just an interesting product with an interesting form factor that I thought I would share with you as yet another unique point of my assorted new and old computers collection. So thank you for watching, and if you have a comment, do feel free to leave one below.